Yeah, I was going to do a talk about fantasy writing and its relationship to the Romantic movement in the 19th century in English literature. Because I was watching a lecture by Sir Roger Scruton, who's a well-known conservative political commentator, who does what he styles as debunking of trendy nonsense in academia and political philosophy. But recently, I was interested to note that he described he actually compared J.K. Rowling to Charles Dickens. Now, the thing is, I think that issue ought to be addressed. Because to me it was quite a telling moment. It was almost quite a revealing moment about what Scruton's really on about. And the thing is, furthermore, there's this fantasy writing in general. This thing about Scruton is a symptom of the fact that, well, since at least Tolkien and C.S.Lewis, fantasy writing has become respectable. Has become like children's fantasy writing has been elevated to a kind of respectable art form. And when I was growing up, people told me, for example, that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. was a Christian allegory. Now, through the minds of many churchgoers, Anglicans, especially Anglican churchgoers in Britain and the Commonwealth, this is quite a common view of things like Lewis stuff, at least, and I've met a variety of different people who were sure that Christian themes and Christian ideas underlie The Lord of the Rings. Now, just for some reason, Stephen Molyneux has been taking on this issue as well, but from a divergent point of view, because it's an allegory. For example, it's believed that in the same way, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe are allegories, are Christian allegories. In the same way, The Lord of the Rings might be, which is the rub, in fact, because the Aslan and the death of Aslan and his return are fairly obvious Christian allegories in Lewis, but on further inspection, Lewis's works and Lewis's theology were really quite different from what people say. In fact, I would go so far to say that there's plenty of evidence, and it's undeniable, and it's in fact fairly obvious, that Lewis and Tolkien were pagans, and they weren't Christian really in any meaningful way, and their writings were entirely pagan, and the only way you could say they were Christian was they were syncretic. They were just, their only relationship to Christianity, if any at all, was a kind of Christian pagan syncretism. Yes, I'm saying that Lewis and Tolkien were crazy heretics. They were crazy heretics like Marcion, like Basilides and Valentinus and all these crazy, wild heretics you read about in the Church Fathers. The more you read about, get into C.S. Lewis, which I did for many years, it's like a journey you go on from being Lewis's Christianity to Lewis's paganism. becomes this sort of, there's nothing, after you read through enough of Lewis, you realise there's nothing of Christianity in it. And the Christianity you were looking for became less and less and less. And now, Lewis is famous for this saying, in Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, he would say, myth became fact. And to the ears of many, many people, that sounds like Jesus of Nazareth is his life and his death and resurrection were the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. It sounds like that. It sounds like that's what he's saying. And when I was younger, and I know a lot of people do still today, they read into what Lewis was saying. They read, well, Jesus was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, and there were many non-Jewish this is something you read, this is certainly Catholic theology, amongst noble pagans, for want of a better name, amongst noble pagans there was philosophy and there was prophecy of a sort. And you can see in Christ fulfillment of the hopes and dreams of Gentile philosophy, not just Jewish philosophy. Now that is that is actually an idea that's quite common, but the evidence for it from the Bible is scant. There's people point to the three kings who visited Jesus at his birth, the Magi they're called, because in Greek it calls them tous magus, the mages from the east. Now, people try to build on that. Well, there's some, along with the story of Israel and the Jews and that prophetic story, there's a concurrent, parallel prophetic story amongst other nations. Now, but that is, again, scanty evidence for that. And Tus Magus, who they're just assumed to be some kind of Eastern astrologer, astronomer, they're just assumed to be some kind of Eastern wise man, which is, I mean, it's actually quite scant, the evidence. These guys were from the East and they'd seen a star. I mean, now there's a whole load of baggage people want to bring in to Christianity through that particular doorway. Astrology and astral determinism, yucky yuck. Now that's insincere, I believe. But the thing is, what I must say is that I do not agree with Lewis and his idea that in Christ myth became fact. That is, I don't agree with him because he's actually wrong and he's misleading, and he's entirely misleading when he says it, because he had something he meant, and he had something, and it's almost as if he knew that he was going to be understood in an entirely different sense by his audience. So he was talking in two different senses. He was talking to one audience and another audience who understood an entirely different thing from what he was saying. Yeah, white men speak with forked tongue. Now there was this guy called, about 100 years ago or more, there was this guy called James Frazer who wrote this massive work on comparative religion called The Golden Bough. And, well, but Frazer's study really was about Western pagan religions, like Greek religions, Roman religion, Druidism, Eastern mysticism, Near Eastern mysticism. That was a subject of Frazer's study, and he wrote this massive work called The Golden Bough, and that is where Lewis got a lot of his stuff from, and he was actually confronted by these assertions in the 50s and 60s on radio shows, and he basically admitted that he had drawn a lot of stuff from Frazer. Now, and well, one of the most frequently cited things Lewis talks about is the story of Balder. He's always talking about Balder the Beautiful, killed by Loki, the mischievous Loki. Balder the Beautiful, the gift of the gods. He was killed and he could only come back part of the year, and so obviously this is obviously a myth about about winter and the winter solstice and autumn and the coming of spring, and the rebirth of spring and the rebirth of the sun and the rebirth of the god and blah 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 blah. Now that is but there's this real insincerity to Lewis, because he didn't actually mention that there's a great deal of commonality between Northern European Druidism, Roman religion, Greek religion, and Mesopotamian religion. And there's similar practices, and similar names, and this mythology about the death of the god and the rebirth of the god, there's thousands of those. There's the passage of a god into Hades and coming out again. Orpheus and Eurydice. That Orpheus and Eurydice has an almost identical version is found in the Sumerian myths. And there's so many pagan myths involving fertility, which are basically involve fertility and the cycle of the seasons, and my point is, for example, that Baal, the religion of Baal, is the original pagan religion. I would go so far to say that all of the pagan religions in the world came from Mesopotamia, and they're all, one way or another, Baal worship. And you can see that in the Silmarillion. You can see that in Gnosticism, the Gnostic writings. There's not because the Mesopotamian pantheon is bound up with the Chaldean calendar system and the Chaldean model of the solar system, this geocentric solar system, and the 7 planets, well, the 7 planets they happen to know about. Now, and the 7 gods corresponding. Now that whole system is the original. That's the original error in human culture, and which is propagated in numberless forms throughout the world and throughout the tribes of the earth. But this is the central problem with C.S. Lewis and his allegorizing, is because I'm not sure whether he's basically tries to imply that the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is an Easter fertility myth. That it's just another Easter fertility myth. There's the dying of the god, and the return in spring, and the return of fecundity, and growth, and now this idea of the Christ being dying and returning as a kind of fertility fertility thing. Well, Jesus actually talked about how, you know, a seed dying, but I don't see the dying God, the dying and reviving God. That is really quite syncretic, and it's so syncretic. And the closer you look at Lewis, there's less and less Christianity and more paganism. Like it's like what people assume is there is this sort of Christian tradition gospel story. You know, there's the Jewish tradition, the gospel story, and there's this parallel pagan mythology, and there's this supposed area of contact where of allegory where they're supposedly related, but they're not. They're not related. Pagan myths are an allegory of the winter solstice, the coming of spring, or whatever their allegories are, but they remain allegories of the natural world, and there's really no contact with Christianity, and there's this side of C.S. Lewis which is completely uninformed by Christianity, and there's this, similarly with Tolkien, there's this side of Tolkien that's completely uninformed by Christianity as well. There's this mythological world, there's people that come and go in it, there's races and tribes and tongues and goings on, but yeah, everyone says, well, you know, Tolkien got this from the Caldar, or Tolkien got this from Norse myths, or Tolkien got this from here or there, borrowed it from, and he sure did. But basically, the closer you look, you see that's all there is paganism. That's all there is folk myth, which rests on paganism. Yeah, and leave it there for a second.